Reflexes are rapid, pre-programmed involuntary responses of muscles or glands to specific stimuli. In other words, if I do stimulus A, I'm always going to get response A. If I do stimulus B, I will always get response B. A reflex has 5 parts. There is a stimulus. There's going to be an afferent pathway. There's an integration center, which has to be some part of the central nervous system. This could be the spinal cord, or it could be the brain. There's going to be an efferent pathway, and then an effector, which is usually going to be a muscle. Reflexes are important because they're a survival mechanism. They allow us to react before we fully understand what's going on, and this can definitely save us some tissue damage. When we look at reflexes, they can either pass through the brain, which would be a cranial-mediated reflex, or the spinal cord, which would be a spinal-mediated reflex. Reflexes can also be somatic, using the skeletal muscles, or visceral. They could be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Mono, of course, means one, poly means many, and so a monosynaptic reflex is literally a single afferent fiber going into the spinal cord and synapsing directly with a motor neuron that goes out to the effector. Polysynaptic can involve multiple interneurons. So which do you think is faster, a monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflex? If we had 2 lines of people, one line consisting of 2 people and the other line consisting of, say, 50 people, and the first person in each line turned to the next person and whispered a message to them, which line is going to get the message to the very end the fastest? So monosynaptic reflexes are really, really fast, but fairly simple, whereas polysynaptic reflexes are much slower, but they can be much more complex. Reflexes can be on the same side of the body, which is ipsilateral, or they can actually affect things on the opposite side of the body, which is contralateral. And then reflexes can be innate, or things that you were born with, or acquired, which means you've learned them after birth. So some examples there. An innate reflex would be the blink reflex. If something disturbs your eyelashes, you blink to prevent things from getting into your eye, whereas, say, driving reflexes are acquired. You don't have to really process a lot of information. If you see something in front of the car, you just naturally stomp on the brakes. So 4 common reflexes are going to be the stretch reflex, Golgi tendon reflexes, withdrawal reflexes, and crossed extensor reflexes. Stretch reflexes and GTOs, or Golgi tendon organ reflexes, rely on proprioceptors. A muscle spindle is a proprioceptor that detects stretch in a muscle. Muscle spindle stretch, and GTOs, or Golgi tendon organs, measure muscular tension. The way a stretch reflex works is that the muscle spindle cell will be stretched, and that's going to be our sensor. It's going to send a signal along our afferent pathway into the spinal cord, which is going to be our integration center. Now, all of our stretch reflexes are ipsilateral and monosynaptic. So they always happen on the same side of the body, and they're always very, very fast. That reflex will then leave through that efferent pathway and go directly to an effector, which in this case would be a muscle. For example, you can have a muscle such as the biceps, or more commonly, the quadriceps muscle. By taking a little rubber hammer and hitting the tendon of the quadriceps, that causes a quick stretch to be placed into the quadriceps, causing the muscle spindle cell to fire through the afferent pathway into the spinal cord, directly synapse with an effector, causing the quadriceps to contract. So that is a monosynaptic ipsilateral stretch reflex. Golgi tendon reflexes prevent muscles from contracting excessively. They're there to prevent the muscles from damaging themselves. So there's proprioceptors at the junction between a muscle and its tendon. And as those Golgi tendon organs fire, they're going to let the brain and the spinal cord know that there's too much tension on the muscle and it needs to be relaxed. Now, if you think about stretch reflexes for a moment, The stretch reflex is actually causing the muscle to contract. So this is doing the opposite. For example, here with our Golgi tendon reflex, we've got the hamstrings contracting, and as they do so, they're going to put a lot of tension on the quadriceps femoris. That's going to cause the GTOs to fire off in the quadriceps, and that's going to cause the quads to actually relax. The Golgi tendon reflex is actually part of what we call reciprocal inhibition, so that as a muscle is actively contracting on one side of a joint, any tension in the muscle on the other side of the joint is going to fire off the Golgi tendon organs, and it's going to cause that muscle to relax on the other side. For example, if you're lifting a weight with your bicep, as that weight is going up, you do not want to engage your tricep at the same time, because then you're fighting not only the weight, but your tricep. Withdrawal reflex is ipsilateral. What happens is that a noxious stimulus occurs on part of the body. The nociceptors are going to send a signal to the spinal cord. That's going to excite some interneurons. And so this is not a monosynaptic reflex. It's polysynaptic because we're dealing with interneurons here. But the interneurons are going to excite the motor neurons of all the flexor muscles. For example, if you put your hand on something hot, the nociceptors start to fire off into the spinal cord, and you're going to go ahead and cause all of the flexor muscles in the arm to contract. So the biceps will contract, the pec major will contract, the wrist flexors and the digital flexors are all going to contract, and you're going to yank your hand away from the noxious stimulus. Crossed extensor reflex is related to the withdrawal reflex, except that in the lower limbs, say if you step on some hot coals, you don't want to use all of your flexor muscles because then you end up sitting on the hot coals. So instead, what we want to do is we want to do a withdrawal reflex on the ipsilateral side, but then on the opposite side of the body, the contralateral side, we're going to do what's called a crossed extensor reflex. So in this case, the ipsilateral side is going to have all the flexor muscles contract, whereas the contralateral side is going to have all the extensor muscles contract. So all the weight is shifted over to the other leg, and all of those muscles are going to fire to keep you standing, but so that the noxious stimulus isn't continuing to bother the one foot. Reflexes are useful clinically for diagnosis. When we do a reflex, we're checking all 5 parts of the reflex arc at the same time. There's no way to really separate them. So a hypoactive reflex is one that is diminished or absent, and that can indicate damage to the spinal cord or the muscle. And then a hyperactive reflex is an abnormally strong response, and that's going to be more indicative of what we call an upper motor neuron problem.